Welcome, new viewers and old viewers, to another episode of The Dancing Negotiator with Dr. Cheryl Okoli, DHA. This is the show where you learn all about conflict and resolution strategies, the what, the why, the when, the where, the who. I introduce original mnemonics like my 5A of conflict resolution mnemonics, and I also introduce evidence-based materials, either of someone who is an expert in conflict resolution or someone that I deem has value to share with the conversation at hand. I like to reserve the third Fridays of each month for story time. This is when we analyze a movie, a drama, an event as it pertains to conflict. I like to reserve the last Friday of each month to have a special guest. As an example, today we will be having a special guest. And before I introduce her to you by her bio and her meeting with us, I would like to recap a little bit. So this whole month of March, we have been discussing all about conflict and forgiveness. And I know some of you might be wondering, if you were to seek justice, does that mean you're harboring unforgiveness? The answer is no. The key is that you should not be vindictive or vengeful in your approach. And what will help you differentiate the different means of mercy, being gracious, or seeking justice is as follows. So I found these definitions that really helped me. So mercy is when you don't get what you do deserve. Grace is getting that which you do not deserve. So think of it as unmerited favor. And justice is getting that which you deserve. And sometimes it could be positive or negative. So keeping that in mind, I have some questions I would like to ask you for reflection before I introduce you to our guest. So today, I would like to ask you to reflect on some instances, either in your workplace or personal relationships, whereby you had to maintain boundaries. You had to forgive an employee, as an example, and an employee or an employer. What was the outcomes of both scenarios? So with not much ado, I'm going to introduce our guest, who I'm very glad is here with us. Her name is Alice Wheaton. She is my first Canadian guest on the show. I just want to give you a heads up that it does appear that we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. You can see her Zoom face, but for some reason her video is not working. But I will read her bio first and then introduce her to you. So Alice Wheaton has been an overachiever throughout her career, not because she is special, but because she's willing to take chances. She began her first career as a cardiac surgery nurse, and because a patient had a near catastrophic event after surgery, she wrote a teaching manual to prevent that situation from happening to others. And she hasn't stopped writing articles, books, and learning focused materials since. Her career focuses on speaking into the lives of others, either one-to-one or on stage in front of international audiences in North and South America, Scandinavia of Europe, and Southeast Asia. She loves teaching others how to get out of their own way and get on with living a successful and highly satisfying life. Now, I'll pause there to say the reason why I really invited her is she has so much value to add. She actually has a book by the name of Imperfect Forgiveness, The Miracle of Releasing Hurts Bit by Bit. And yes, I had the pleasure. I made sure I read it before today. So with not much ado, welcome, Alice. How are you?
Thank you very much. That's such a very kind introduction. I'm gonna really have to live up to that. Thanks.
Yeah, well, welcome once again. So with not much ado, please tell us why you chose nursing as a profession initially and what made you pivot.
Oh, that's interesting. I grew up completely off the grid, like in a very isolated, poor, uneducated region of Canada. And and my goal always to be a nurse, because in that particular culture, women were typically, homemakers. And but if they did have a job, it was either teacher as a nurse. I tried teaching for a year and didn't like that very much. So then I went into nursing school. And then when I was in nursing, I realized that I was better suited for the high drama, high intensity area. Not very glamorous, for sure, but intensive care and ICU, because I have the ability to put my emotions and feelings and thoughts to the side and do the right thing, because it's the right thing to do.
Okay.
And so I met a woman in emergency who said, I think you'd be great in sales. And the reason is because I had asked her a few questions about herself, and she felt, I guess, engaged. And she said, you should go to work. Like I said, well, I have no idea where I go. She said, well, why don't you go to Xerox? They're not hiring women yet, but my husband is the manager there. So they'll make sure if you use them as a reference, they'll make sure you get an interview. And so I think it was 9 or 11 interviews later, I actually became the first woman in sales at Xerox Canada. And because I was so terrified of failing, I don't know if anyone's ever lived with a knot in their stomach, but I lived with a knot in my stomach for probably 3 years. Wow. And so because of that, then I always had to sell more. And I became the top performer there. It's interesting, 10 years ago, there was a reunion for Xerox. And as I got up to leave, I noticed there was a line of women going to the door, and it was all these women were standing in line to shake hands with me for having broken that particular ceiling and paved the way for them. Wow. And so what I learned, if there was one lesson that came out of that, is that success is proportional to my willingness to be rejected.
Okay, wow. Well, that's very impressive. And that's quite a pivot change. I mean, I've heard of, very few engineers pivot into nursing, but I've never heard of a nurse pivot to the business world. So that's very interesting. So what type of interpersonal or employee or business conflicts have you encountered before, during the pandemic?
Well, I've over the years to create prosperity for myself. I took the money and my contracts with big organizations were typically 6 figures. Now, but Cheryl, understand that I didn't start out that way. I started out maybe charging $500 a day just because there was nobody paving the way for me. So pretty soon I was charging like $100,000 a contract for a year's consulting. And so I did not understand investing, but I understood housing. And so I developed property. I bought properties, developed them, and so on. And so as a result of that, it also gave me a good, grounding in business. So I was able to run my business as a business versus a hobby, or sometimes hobby.
So what kind of conflicts did you encounter?
Well, there's conflicts everywhere. Mm-hmm. That's for sure. Mm-hmm. But I found myself picking and choosing the conflicts that I would get engaged in. So not every conflict is ours to resolve. Mm-hmm. Right? So my opinion, I would say the biggest conflicts I've arose is that throughout my life, I've been very liberal in that I would refuse to date anyone that was a homophobic, racist, or sexist. And so what I learned in resolving that kind of conflict, just that particular kind, was that walk away power. and give people the right to be who they are and who they're not. When it comes to corporate conflict, I haven't had that many, but when it comes to tenant issues, I have had quite a few over the years, obviously over 25 years. And so I found that it's a tiny little trick, but I never get mad. I never took anything personally. Or if I did, I didn't, leak that all over the place. Also, I came to realize that my feelings are mine to manage. So if I walk around saying, well, you hurt my feelings, then I quickly began to reframe and say, well, who's in charge of my feelings? It's me. So therefore, I will manage how I respond to that. Now, what that meant is that I had to shift a bit, Cheryl, from being emotional, dramatic, right, to more neutral, middle of the road. Probably it made me more boring, because it's at this point in my life, it is impossible to hook me into being angry or enraged or resentment or anything. But I've been doing this work for 25 years.
Okay. So during your experiences, again, let's keep this business related in the workplace. What signs have you seen either in yourself or others that suggest that forgiveness is needed as a result of conflict? Now, let's keep this in perspective. So when I talk about conflict has two sides to it. It could be constructive, which is something that builds up relationships or a team or an organization, or it could be destructive in the sense that it tears down relationships, employee satisfaction goes downhill, or employee morale goes downhill, or sales goes downhill, basically. So keeping that in mind, usually conflict, especially when it's destructive in nature, there are some hurts people are harboring. So from your perspective, can you give us example of some signs that suggest that either you yourself or an employee or an organization needs to forgive?
Oh, thanks for that reframing. I was coaching a group of people they were administrators, they were support people. Mm-hmm. And one of the big issues was gossip. And so one day someone, and this is the process I use for that. One day someone was gossiping about someone else, and this was for a municipality outside of Calgary. And this woman was always gossiping about one person or another. And I said to her, Linda, would you please hold that thought? And I'm going to go and get this person we're talking about poorly, and we're going to just have them sit there and listen to us gossip about them. Would that be okay with you? And I think she felt that it was really harsh, but that became my process thereafter of working with people who were complainers or gossipers. I would say, well, let's get the person that you're complaining about into our presence so that they have a chance to clarify things, work things through with you, and sort things out. What I found now, their behavior changed, and suddenly because gossip is the knife that slices away at the fabric of a team. And in my experience, that has been one of the biggest issues with team development and corporate development and getting along as a group. Because when people gossip, they're really assassinating someone else's character, right?
That's right.
And so the moment when I said, fine, we can talk about her, and we can rip her apart, and we can just criticize her, but I'd like her in the room, please.
Okay.
Suddenly, that So not only, so it was, they might have felt it as confrontational, but when I was around, they never gossiped about anyone else ever. Like just that one little quick tool is, sure, Cheryl, we can talk about Linda, but can we please get her in the room and have her observe us talking about her in a negative way?
So that's an example. Definitely when you talk about gossip and assassination of character, those are bullying behaviors actually as well, psychological damage being done to an individual. So
but it's not psychological damaging unless they know about it. Because what gossipers tend to do is be what we call two-faced.
yes.
When the person is in the room, they're sweet and kind. But when they're not in the room, they feel they've given themselves full permission to practice what I call character assassination.
Yeah, so but either way, whether the individual is aware of the fact they're being gossiped about, either way, it's still a bullying behavior.
You're absolutely right.
So my question though is, so we could look at it in two ways here. So the individual that's being gossiped about, since that's the example you're using, the individual that's being gossiped about, when it comes to their knowledge, somehow, because the effects will be felt one way or the other, either there might be isolation or there may be a lack of promotion because information is being perpetuated and it gets up to the boss who listens perhaps to what people are saying, because one of those things people look at are how's your ability to interact with other people. But if you're getting false reports from people who are gossiping, you're obviously not going to evaluate this person accurately. So if this individual knows about this, for instance, what are the signs the individual that is a victim or recipient, I prefer to use the word recipient, of gossiping or any other behavior in the workplace, what are the signs they might exhibit that shows or tells you that they need to forgive the perpetrators?
Well, one of the things that so naturally after, as a consequence of being a victim of being gossiped, there is resentment, right?
Could be.
Now, resentment is extraordinarily sexy.
That's an interesting way of describing it. I've never heard of that before, but carry on.
Well, it's extraordinarily sexy because when someone is resentful of someone else, they're presuming that they would have managed the situation better, different, faster, easier. When someone is being resentful, then they build a story in their mind about how they're the righteous, kind, nice, practical one. And when this other person, they ascribe characters to them of mean, bossy, unsupportive, etc. And so I call that cheap self-esteem. And so because it presumes that we're like, if I was thinking about this about someone, it presumes I'm thinking of myself as perfect and never make mistakes. Consequently, even today, I call myself a perfectly imperfect human woman. But we're brought up, most people, I know in my town, in my family, girls were brought up to be sensitive, caring, helpful. We sure weren't brought up to be assertive and say, you know what, you've asked me 5 times and I've helped you 5 times, but I'm not, there is no 6th time. And so what happens, because people don't have boundaries, Cheryl, they have no choice in a way but to feel resentful. Most, I have great boundaries. Consequently, I'm almost never resentful. Right? And so
tell us a little bit more about the boundaries. How do you define boundaries, and how would you apply boundaries to conflict and forgiveness? The key word is conflict and forgiveness.
Well, when there's no conflict, you don't need forgiveness. You know, like I like to say, grace. When you show someone forgiveness, you're actually showing them grace and mercy, right? But if there's no conflict, you don't need forgiveness. But if there's no conflict, then life is very dull.
So could we? Sorry to interrupt you. When you say when there's no conflict, please, just so we're all clear, are you referring to destructive conflict or
Well, any kind
constructive
of
conflict?
Well, the thing is, though, is that the really smart person, and I use smart, loosely, I can't imagine anything in my life now that I don't transform into a benefit for myself. Any kind of conflict, any kind of drama, any kind of frustration. Like if someone is like, I turn that into something that I can, I don't know, masterfully transition into something better, sort of like turning lead into gold, as it were. You don't really turn lead into gold, but, oh, hang on a second. I've got a workman downstairs, so I just heard him drill, so forgive me if it happens again. I'll go and ask him to stop. So I feel sorry for people who walk through life trying to avoid conflict.
Okay.
Cheryl, I gotta be 1 second.
Okay, so viewers, as Alice goes off to talk to someone shortly there, the key question is, think about boundaries. What do boundaries mean to you? So I like to think of the difference between a boundary and a wall.
What's that, boundaries on the wall?
No, sorry, I was just saying, just before you join us, I just want to finish something I'm talking to the viewers about. So the difference between boundary and the walls, in my opinion, is with boundaries, think of it like a gate. You can come in and out, or someone can come in and out. But with a wall, there's no entry point or exit point. So in relationships, ask yourself, the stance I'm taking right now, is it a wall or is it a boundary? So Alice, please tell us, what is your description of a boundary and how does that apply in forgiveness?
Well, I love the concept of the boundary and the wall. I'm just going to riff on this for a second, then we'll go into forgiveness. I have a business partner in one property. I constantly have to reinforce my boundaries. And I also have to have a big wall. And that's for protect, because some people are narcissists, some people are users. There's all of these people. And so how would you forgive that person? I just simply say to myself, she has a right to be who she is. She has a right to be who she's not. That means I'm neutral about her. So she cannot upset me. Because when she has a right to be, now we're not partners in a business, I would disassociate myself, whether it's a wall or whether it's a moat, whether it's a concrete barricade, like were she not a business partner, I would detach, right? And so forgiveness means that I don't have an agenda for how people behave. She has a right to be who she is. She has a right to be who she's not. And when I take judgment away, then forgiveness seeps in bit by bit by bit anyway.
Okay. So how would you describe boundaries?
A boundary is when I say to, for instance, if she phones me, I will say, Janice, now is not a good time. I need to collect my thoughts and I need to do a bit of paperwork before we can have this relevant conversation, because I'm not going to talk about personal things. She also is a complainer. And she called me one day complaining. And I said, just so you know, you're on speakerphone and my husband is sitting next to me. The minute I said that, she became sweet and kind and conciliatory.
Isn't it interesting how people morph differently and act differently when they know there are other parties listening in?
I know, Cheryl. And that's, to me, though, that is I don't know where I come from in Newfoundland, we call that two-faced, right?
Hypocritical would be the
Yeah, like,
standard layman's term.
yeah, and you know, our conversation, we tend to be, even though we're not a very educated community, we tend to be very blunt. It's like, you know, someone say, oh, there's Wayne. And it's like, well, what side of his face was he talking out of today?
Yeah.
Right?
So I'm just being mindful of the time. We have only about 5 minutes left, but I just wanted to squeeze in one more question before we end. And along the lines of when you say two-faced, it actually reminds me of a social psychological term. The term social psychologists would use is a social chameleon. As we know what a chameleon does. So yes. Okay. So in your opinion, given that you like developing materials for workplaces, do you think that when organizations have orientation classes, as an example, that there should be a subsection that discusses forgiveness as it pertains to conflict? What are your thoughts?
Yes, because resentment without forgiveness, people ruminate, and I call that resentment. And resentment sucks the life out of the person who holds it. It's like having a bucket of acid and drinking it yourself instead of giving it to someone else, right?
Yeah.
But more importantly, and this, people say to me, wow, you don't look your age. And it's because I'm not resentful of anybody, because resentment ages you very, very quickly. You have these pursed lips and you have these lines between your eyes. Like, resentment means that you're mad most of the time about somebody or something.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that about the age thing. I too have gotten some comments. Oh my goodness, you can't believe you're older than you look. Yeah. And I say things like, well, yeah, and I want to stay that way.
Yeah. So, yeah, I know. Like I was at Home Depot yesterday, and the guy said to me, because I'm renovating, he said, oh, you look tired. I said, yeah, I'm 70. I shouldn't be doing this. And he said, you're 70? Like, I wouldn't have even said 60. But I'm not walking around with a frown and mad and annoyed and frustrated all the time, because I have a voice and I use that voice to vote for me.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you, Alice. I see that we have about 3 minutes left. And yes, I really appreciate what you had to say. It feels like time has flown by. I encourage you, the viewers, to pick up her book called Imperfect Forgiveness, The Miracle of Releasing Hurt Bit by Bit. And Alice, where can the viewers reach you? Do you have any website or materials?
Well, I have a brand new website that's launching on Monday, AliceWheaton.com. If they want it, the book, they can grab it on Amazon. Okay. And by the way, if any of your viewers want to reach out to me, if that's okay with you, and say, hey, I've got this scenario, can you help me unpack it and create a strategy? I'd be happy to do that.
Excellent. I'm sure they will appreciate that.
Yeah, and my email is alice@alicewheaton.com, so that's pretty easy.
Excellent. So viewers, I hope you guys have gleaned something about conflict, forgiveness, and boundaries. You know where to find me, same place, same time, for another episode of The Dancing Negotiator with Dr. Cheryl Okoli, DHA. I say my thank you to Alice Wheaton for joining us. But before we just cut off for this episode, I like to always leave you with this thought. I want you to remember that you are needed in this world to be a solution. Be the best that you can. And do not rob the world of a precious gem, you. Well, have a splendid day. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, Cheryl. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.